The Civil War, the war between the states, or the War of Northern Aggression, no matter what you call it, it was the longest and bloodiest war this country has endured. The effects of the war on the home front, both Northern and Southern, were devastating. The war forced families to survive any way they could, using and doing things that they never would have imagined before the war. The conversations that you will hear here today could have taken place on either side of the Mason-Dixon line. And while the northern states certainly suffered deprivation, it was the loss of the supply lines with the naval blockade in 1862 that tested Southern resolve beyond anything they could have imagined. Herbal knowledge, while certainly more prevalent in households during the Civil War than it is now, was not always the standard as it had been in colonial times. This nation was well on its way to modernization by the time we faced the Civil War. The years leading up to the war afforded women the opportunity to purchase items that during colonial times would have been produced at home. The war forced homemakers to relearn skills that had been replaced by the convenience of the dry goods store and the traveling salesman. Please join us now as we glimpse into the past and join a group of women as they share some thoughts on homemaking, cooking, and gardening, and a celebration that they planned during the war years.
I swear, of all these things this war has done to me, I miss coffee the most. You can brew these dried sweet potatoes all day long, and they don't taste like no coffee.
Well, if you just put a tad of chicory in those potatoes while they brew, it will make it palatable, but just barely.
I just gave up drinking anything that I was trying to make like coffee. I am just drinking my garden tea. I dried my leaves from the sassafras and can steep them all winter long. You try those sage leaves from the kitchen garden, and you will be pleased. It isn't real English tea, but it is more satisfying than trying to make something like coffee.
I agree. Forget the coffee. It isn't coming back anytime soon. But if you go to the wood and pick up the wild herbs, hang them up in the rafters like our grannies used to do, you can have some good drink, especially from the wild raspberries. Pick those leaves just when they start to sprout, and you will have some fine tea. But remember, in order for herb tea to do anyone any good, it needs to steep a very long time to make it nice and strong.
I miss my fine white sugar. This war has certainly hurt my sweet tooth. Sweet potatoes don't make that raspberry tea as sweet as I would like.
Have you tried the sorghum? It's not as pretty as the sugar, but it's sure as sweet.
You all miss the sugar. I miss my garden. Remember when we could walk at dusk and just touch and smell our flowers? And now every inch in my garden must be filled with vegetables to eat. Herbs to make the pitiful meat we are forced to cook into something we can swallow. Or more herbs just to try and keep the family and the animals as well as anyone has a right to expect during this terrible time.
Do you still have the old man in your garden? I certainly hope so. It is the only way to make absinthe, and how does one get through these times without the spirit?
Making meals now has certainly tried my imagination. I remember my mother's breakfast stew of beef. These days I am lucky if I have squirrel stew to serve in the morning. At least I have summer savory still to add to flavor. Along with onions and sweet marjoram, I am glad I still have the garden space and small amount of time to devote to my sweet herbs instead of having to depend on the woods for all of my herbs.
You don't need to grow all your herbs. As much as we enjoy the sweet herbs, we can get wild herbs from the wood and fields. You know, I do sort of fancy a goose that is fed on the wild onions and thyme of the woods, rather than the more refined herbs of my garden.
Have you put up your vinegars yet this summer? I've put up some tarragon and nasturtiums, and I'm thankful I was able to have vinegars, strong as it was. It does go a good way in covering up the food we are forced to eat these days.
I have a very nice batch of wormwood vinegar. I set it in the creek to make sure it stayed cold while steeping. It should be ready next week. It is always good to have the wormwood vinegar on hand, with the children always spraining something.
I hope you didn't put your tarragon too close to your wormwood in the plot, even though they are cousins. It does not good to have sweet tarragon next to the bitter wormwood.
How much room are you able to give your herbs this year?
I generally try to follow Mrs. Haskell's rules from her housekeeper's encyclopedia, you know. Nasturtiums spread very much. A bed 3 by 6 with 6 plants would be sufficient. Parsley, a bed 3 by 6, or you can use parsley as a border for the other beds. A bed 3 by 6 for sage, the same for summer savory. Half as much room for thyme and sweet marjoram's a bed 3 by 6 containing wormwood, tansy, and old man.
I try to follow her rules, but you know me, I'm always getting carried away and plant more than I can use. Well, that was true before the war, but now I plant as much as I can, and if there is extra, there's always someone coming down the road who is more in need of them than us, so we share our good herbs.
I'm especially grateful for my parsley this time of the year. I am enjoying the double-curled one that I sowed last spring, and the plants from last year are now producing seed. You know, it takes them 2 years to bear seed. I find that most interesting.
Speaking of parsley and Mrs. Haskell, I did try her method of keeping my curled parsley growing through the winter by putting the roots through holes in the bottom of an old barrel and leaving the crowns nearly outside. I put the barrel in a place in the cellar that does get some light and watered the soil a couple of times a week. She was right. I enjoyed the parsley most of last winter in soups and broths. It even makes some of these dreadful meats taste almost manageable.
You will do well if you take a small patch of ground and raise most important herbs like sage and summery, green wormwood and hyssop, horehound motherwort, catnip. Don't bother with burdock. You can always gather that in the fields, and I swear there is little difference. Those who not have the ground space would do well to gather herbs in some quantities from friends. If you find you are still lucky enough to have herbs left, you would do quite well to share them with the apothecaries, as they make quite an excellent profit when there are monies to be had.
It was easy to keep the herbs manured when we had the chickens, but they have been gone for a long time now. But we do what we can. Still, the herbs take less care than the flowers, but I miss the flowers something fierce.
You shall have your flowers soon enough. Right now, we need to get down to the business we have gathered for, wedding planning.
Have we enough ketchup to serve at the wedding festival?
I have just put up my regular tomato variety, and I must say it is very good with my sweet peppers and a whole quart of horseradish juice. Hot but good.
I put up Mrs. Haskell's walnut ketchup 2 years ago. It should be excellent by now and perfect for the grand celebration. And I hope all of you are grateful for my sacrifice. Remember when I fell out of the tree while gathering walnuts? Thank goodness for Mrs. Child's poultice of wheat bran and vinegar. I did have to use the last of my brown paper to make it, but once I dipped it in the molasses, it did a fine job of taking down the swelling from my bruised ankle. And it was very helpful on my old mare's swollen leg also. We really did get our use out of that poultice. Good for me, good for my horse.
I have several ideas for the wedding cake. I guess it just depends on what we can find to bake with. If we can gather our hidden sugar, we might be able to put together a plain pound cake. But that's going to take sugar and butter and fine flour. All I have left is the harsh wheat flour.
I do have some fine flour that I put away for just an occasion like this. It would be wonderful if we could make a plum wedding cake. I have a nutmeg left, but not the citrus peels. Those were sent to the war with my men. I hope it has helped them.
We could make just a common seed cake. If I find the caraway seeds, it could even be a rich seed cake.
Remember when there was no question about what kind of cake? The 12th cake was served at almost all weddings.
Yes, I remember. My own cake had currants, almonds, citron, candied orange, and lemon peel. And the spices were wonderful. Allspice, cinnamon, mace, ginger, and coriander. And a whole gill of brandy in the cake. I remember my man baked that cake for 4 hours. It was quite the star of the wedding feast.
Oh yes, I had a 12th cake also. It was nearly 14 inches tall and covered with a beautiful blue frosting, just for brides. Do you think we could try to put the blue icing on a plain seed cake?
We can try, but you know that it takes much sugar to make icing, and we have a very limited amount. I don't know if anyone has the blue powder, let alone the sixpence to use as a measurement.
Well, the cake aside, we certainly will be serving up a fine celebration drink. I think my cider wine. I am sure I have enough honey to mix with the cider. And if we start now, I think we can make some spruce and boneset beer. We can use molasses to sweeten that, but we have to start soon because it needs to ferment. I think my hops are dry now, and I am about ready for beer making.
Well, it will be a fine celebration indeed. What is the wardrobe for the bride?
I hear she will wear the veil handed down from her family, but she will have to do with a homespun dress. She will have to do with one that she has. But since the dye has faded, we can dip it again. I have a cultivated indigo plant. We can dip her dress at one of our indigo churnings when we refresh our clothing.
She needs to have a warm woolen shawl. I have a good piece of wool that can be dyed with myrtle from the woods. The soft gray will go nicely with the indigo blue.
You best check that wool. Unless you have stored it with pennyroyal, you might have given the bugs a feast.
I cannot abide the smell of pennyroyal. I put a mixture of lavender and wormwood in with my woolens, just as Mr. Culpepper recommends.
You can add a bit of dried ground sweet flag, mint, southernwood, and wormwood to make the scent more pleasing.
If the bride prefers a yellow tone, we could perhaps come up with a new homespun for her and use some horseradish leaves. And Lord knows I have enough of them, but they do produce a nice soft yellow if steeped correctly.
I have just had another thought about the decorations for the cake. If we can pick wild violets in the woods, we can sugar them in the syrup and serve them on the cake. And of course the trick would be to find enough sugar amongst us all.
That would be very lovely, but the key is the sugar. We must first concentrate on the cake, and then we can see about the icing and the flowers.
It'll be a grand celebration. Let us try to put a bit of joy and happiness into this terrible time.
You are correct. We must try to lift the spirits of all who attend, for God knows this is a terrible time for us.
Well, I think we have things started. Let's take our leave and return home to gather our treasures for this celebration.
Godspeed and safety to you all.